Galatians chapter 3, and I shall be reading the first 14 verses. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? Have you suffered so much for nothing? If it really was for nothing. Does God give you his Spirit and work miracles among you because you observe the law or because you believe what you heard? Consider Abraham. He believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. All who rely on observing the law are under a curse, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law." Clearly, no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, the man who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree." He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Last week we started a sort of study of some of the major characters in church history. And no study of characters in church history, especially if we're looking at those who have influenced our understanding of the Bible as an evangelical Protestant church, would be complete without a mention of this man. Anybody know who this is? Jane, I bet you know who this is.
Is it Wycliffe or Luther?
Martin Luther, that's the one. Martin Luther was born in 1483 and he became a priest in the church. And at that time there was only the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. He became a priest within that church and then became a monk and settled into life as a monk. And monastic life at that time was tough. And it was deliberately so. It was meant to be very austere, very difficult, and in fact painful. It was meant to be difficult to live as a monk. You see, the teaching of that at that time, and the teaching within the church, was that the only way to please God was to live by very strict social, ethical, and spiritual rules. And it was taught that any sin, any deviation from those rules in any way had to be punished. And it was either going to be punished now, in this life, or it was going to be punished in the next. And we'll look in a little while at something of that punishment in the next life. And so the monks deliberately lived this incredibly austere life. Some of them went to great extremes to make life unpleasant and difficult. They ate particularly horrible foods to make themselves ill. They lived in clothes that irritated and hurt. And that went to some really, really extreme cases of deprivation that monks went to in order to punish themselves, to purge themselves of sin, to make amends for any wrong that they might have done, for any sin that they may have committed in any way. See, the thinking was that if you didn't pay for your sin here and now in this life, through some kind of punishment or deliberately austere leading, well, you were going to have to pay for it in purgatory. When you died, you weren't going to go straight to heaven as a Christian believer. Instead, you were going to go to a kind of holding place where you would be punished. And that place was known as purgatory. And some of the depictions of the punishment that would happen in purgatory were just horrendous. And it was thought that people might have to spend sort of thousands of years in purgatory paying for any sin that hadn't been paid for in this life before they were able to go to heaven. All that sin had to be got rid of and paid for and dealt with before the believer could go to heaven. But the church could grant indulgences. Now, initially the Pope, and later on the bishops, and later still any Roman Catholic priest, was given the right to forgive, on God's behalf, certain sins that people had committed, so that they wouldn't have to go to purgatory and pay for that sin, or certainly could reduce the amount of time spent in purgatory. To be granted an indulgence, as it was called, to be granted forgiveness for some sin in this life, you had to make some great good work, some good act. And it was thought the best way of doing that was to contribute financially to God's work. Of course, where is God's work done? It's done in and through the church. So if you contributed financially, a good, healthy contribution to the church meant that you could be granted indulgences and therefore have to spend less time in purgatory. As the theory developed, it wasn't just for yourself you could do this. If a loved one had died and you were worried that they were spending lots and lots of time in purgatory, well, you could make a nice, big, healthy contribution to the local church, and the priest would grant an indulgence and pray for that person so that their time in purgatory would be reduced. And the church was making a fortune out of selling indulgences. People were so scared that they were going to have to spend time in purgatory to remove their sin. Literally, it's where the word comes from, to purge their sin. They were terrified of spending thousands and thousands of years in a place of horrendous punishment. And so they were contributing huge amounts of money to the church in order to have that time reduced. While this was happening, and while this theory was developing, and the church was making more and more money out of this, Martin Luther was serving as a monk in Wittenberg. And he was struggling with the teaching. He was struggling with sin. Temptations were coming his way all the time. And he knew that it wasn't just the physical act of sin, it was thinking about things, it was bad thoughts, and he was having these terrible thoughts, and he was trying desperately to control them and to live the life of a pious, good monk, and struggling against all this sin. He was trying to keep the law. And he knew that God was righteous, and that the way he was living would not be pleasing to God, and he was terrified of the punishment that he was going to receive from a righteous God. Later on, he wrote about this time in his life. And he said this, he said, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he, as God, was placated by my satisfaction. I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. I was angry with God." He'd read about God dealing with sinners in righteousness, about the righteousness of God coming to sinners. He saw that as being God in his righteousness coming and being ready to punish sinners. And yet God didn't seem able to remove in him this desire to sin. And so he ended up almost hating God, who couldn't remove this desire to sin and yet was ready to come and punish him in the last days, who was going to condemn him to thousands of years in purgatory to pay for the sin that God had been unable or unwilling to remove from his life. Trying so desperately hard to keep the rules, trying to live a Christian life by following rules, leads to resentment, fear, and anger. And this is the truth that the Christian church keeps on discovering over and over again. When we make Christianity about following rules, it leads to a fear of God. It leads to resentment and anger, not a love for God. Because we always discover, as Luther did, that we can't keep all the rules. Biblical law doesn't make us righteous. Biblical law shows us that we're sinful. That was the purpose of the Old Testament law. It showed that humans are sinful. It highlighted our need of a forgiver. It did not show us a way that we could become righteous. We can't. We fail. Every human has done. The point had been made in Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. All who rely on observing the law are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of law." If we insist that the way to be righteous and the way to be right with God is by following the rules, then we've got to obey every single law, every rule, every single hour of every day of our lives. Once you break one part of it, the law curses you. It doesn't set you free. It doesn't make you righteous. And we have all broken one of those rules at some point in our lives. We've all probably broken most of them, most of the time. We are not righteous by following the rules. The law condemns us. It curses us. We can't be righteous by following the law. As Martin Luther struggled with sin and temptation, struggling to make sense of the righteousness of God and the God of love, which seemed to contradict each other in his view, he started thinking about the teaching of the church. He started thinking about all the things that he'd been taught all the time, and particularly his mind started to think about the whole idea of indulgences. And he went to his Bible. And he said, where does this idea of indulgences come from? Where does this idea that we're going to spend time in purgatory to pay for our sin, where does that come from in the Bible? Where does the idea that we can give money to the church and therefore be forgiven for some of our sin and so spend less. Where does that come from in the Bible, he said. And he searched and he scoured. And eventually he decided they were real problems. And so, in what has become known as this great act, he went to the local church in Wittenberg and he nailed onto the door of that church a great sheet of paper with 95 theses against indulgences, 95 arguments that said indulgences were wrong. It sounds like a horrendous act of defiance, doesn't it? Nailing this to the door of the church. It wasn't quite how it sounded. The door of the church was effectively used as a notice board. It was a place to put up notices, and particularly a place to start discussion. If you wanted to discuss something to do with the church, to do with the Bible, you would put a notice on there and invite everybody, let's come and talk about this, let's discuss it. It was a standard thing to do. So it wasn't a great act of rebellion that it sounds like today. It was him saying, I've got a real problem. In fact, I've got 95 problems with these. Can somebody come and explain it? Can somebody come and help me think through these things? And he nailed this to the door and said, let's talk about this. However, nobody was able to talk to him about it. He continued to think through some of the problems. He continued to think through the teaching of the church. He continued to wrestle with the idea of sin. And he started writing things down, and his writing brought him into all manner of trouble with the church, and eventually with the Pope himself, and even with the Emperor at that time. But as he wrestled, as he thought through these issues, as he struggled with the righteousness of God, one day he read a particular verse. And it's a verse, as we've looked through the book of Romans, it's a verse that we've come across. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Where Paul, and remember Paul wrote this, and Paul was somebody who'd struggled with the whole keeping the rules as a Pharisee as well. He'd kind of gone through a similar route to Martin Luther. And Paul wrote, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And as he read those words, God spoke to him in a really powerful way, and the truth of these words hit home to him. And suddenly his great struggle against sin, his great struggle to be righteous through action, eased and melted and disappeared. The righteousness of God, he realized, was not a threat of God to come in righteousness and punish him. The righteousness of God was a promise to give righteousness as a gift to those who have faith in Jesus Christ, those who have trusted the gospel of which Paul was not ashamed. He realized that we are made righteous by our faith in Jesus Christ, not by following rules. Luther called that verse his gateway into a new faith, into a new relationship with God. He didn't have to earn righteousness by law-keeping and harsh living. He received righteousness from God. And Luther had rediscovered the doctrine of which the church needs to keep on being reminded. the truth that we are made righteous, that is being in a right relationship with God. We are given that as a gift of his grace. We don't earn it in any way. Faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Faith that he died to pay for our sin, and he paid the full price of our sin. He paid for every sin. Nothing left to be paid for in purgatory. Nothing we have to treat ourselves harshly for in this life. Our sin is paid for, dealt with, done. He realized that it was the faith that he showed when he first repented and trusted Jesus that made him righteous. Not surprisingly, Luther was held to account for his beliefs. And when he refused to stop writing, he was eventually summoned to a meeting. Now, if any of you ever decide that you want to look up a little bit of church history, and particularly look up, Protestant evangelical church history, you will come across a chapter in any of those history books that gives you the wrong impression the moment you first see it. Because you will come across a chapter entitled this, The Diet of Worms. And you're all thinking, I remember that song when I was a boy, I'm going to eat some worms. And we'll start thinking that this is maybe something to do with those austere monks and something that they did in order to try and make themselves righteous with God. No, it isn't. A diet at that time was a meeting. A diet was a gathering together, a hearing of the authorities, the councils within the church. Worms, as we would read that, actually is Worms, which is a place in Germany. So this isn't some latest celebrity fad diet that's being suggested. The diet of Worms was a meeting, a hearing in a place called Worms. And at this diet, Luther was called to account for the things that he had been writing. He was called to account for suggesting that indulgences were wrong. He was called to account for saying that once somebody had shown that faith in Jesus Christ, they were forgiven and had no sin left to pay for. He was called to account for writing that righteousness was given by God to those with faith. It wasn't something that could be earned. He stood there, he refused to recant what he had written. He explained why he'd written it, why he thought the Pope was wrong. That's a dangerous thing to do in the Catholic Church. He was excommunicated. And the reason that every church history book will have something about the Diet of Worms in there is because inadvertently what happened here was Martin Luther started a new church. He hadn't intended to. He'd wanted to bring reform within the existing church, but he was excommunicated, he was thrown out. He could not work within that church any longer. And so people started to turn to him in this new church. The people who followed him, the people who listened to what he wrote, were called the protest group. It was known as the protest church. And those who followed him were known as Protestants because they were protesting against the Catholic Church. It's where we get the name Protestant from today. We are a Protestant church. One that follows in this line that was set up initially in protest at some of the things the Catholic Church was teaching. And as Luther continued to work through the Bible with this newfound, this God-given understanding of what righteousness was really all about, he started to set out what this protest church was going to look like, what its doctrines were going to be, what its way of worshipping God was going to be. And he would look all the time, what does the Bible teach? What does the Bible teach on this? Not what has been handed down through the generation, not what has the church taught. What does the Bible actually say on these things? And he noticed something really important about how people generally lived their Christian lives compared to what the Bible taught about Christian lives. And he noticed that although people would come to faith believing that it was their faith that saved them, it was their faith that made them right with God, they would so often fall back on following rules when it came to their ongoing Christian life. They felt that to remain in a right relationship with God, they had to follow certain rules rather than trusting that their faith kept them right with God. And it was the book of Galatians, a part of which we read from chapter 3, that really helped him to see the dangers of that way of thinking, the dangers of falling back on rules in the Christian life. Galatians was written to a church that had initially accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ and was doing well, but which had been infiltrated by Judaizers. People from the Jewish faith infiltrated it and said, yes, okay, now that you're following God, you've got to start following the Jewish rules. You've got to start following the Jewish food laws. You've got to start following all sorts of other Jewish ways of doing things in order to be kept right. And Paul wrote at the beginning of chapter 3, he says, who has bewitched you? Or who has deceived you? He said, you've been deceived. You've been sent off on the wrong track. You've been deceived into thinking that although God saved you through grace and through your faith in Jesus Christ, you've been deceived into thinking that to remain right with God, you've got to start following rules. And that if you don't follow those rules, you're going to lose your relationship with God. He said, as soon as you start following the law, as soon as you start following rules, you're going to see that it just condemns you. It curses you because you can't keep all those rules. The Galatian church had forgotten what their initial faith was in. Verse 13, their faith was in Jesus who had become a curse for them. He'd allowed himself to be treated as a cursed man. He was nailed to a cross of wood to pay for their sin. Failing to keep the rules curses you, but Jesus says, I will be that curse. I will be cursed in your place. Don't go following those rules and take that curse on yourself. I've become the curse. I've dealt with your sin. It's paid for. It's done. You're forgiven. You're declared righteous by a God of justice and love. Now live in that faith. Live every day trusting that Jesus has paid for your sin. Verse 11, the righteous, that is those who are right with God, will live by faith. Faith that tells us that our sin is paid for. Faith that tells us that we don't need to feel guilty. Faith that Jesus has paid for our sin. Faith that says we cannot appease God through good works. Faith that says he has given us righteousness as a gift and we can't lose it. The book of Galatians was written to remind Christians that their relationship with God is maintained by faith. Faith in all that Jesus has done for us. our relationship with God, our righteousness, is not maintained by doing right things. Martin Luther called the book of Galatians his Katie von Bora. Katie, or Katerina von Bora, to give her full title, was his wife. He was saying that the doctrines laid out in Galatians were what he was going to betroth himself to. Just as he had betrothed himself to Katie for life and said, I will live with her for life. We will go through life together. So he said, the doctrines in this book are like that. I am going to wed myself to them. I am going to marry them. I am going to live with them every day of my life for the rest of my life. Living our life with faith in Jesus Christ is what we should say, for until death us do part. He had been set free from the law that had ruined the early part of his life. And he'd been enabled to live without guilt and without fear because of his God-given faith in Jesus Christ. And so as he started teaching, as he set up this church, it was with this idea that we are not going to set rules. Everybody's got to live by these rules. Everybody's got to do these things. He said, no, you will live by faith. You will trust that Jesus has paid in full for every wrong thing that you have ever done. You will trust that to keep you right with God. Don't trust in your actions. Now, the accusation that will always come at teaching grace over law is that it says, so you're free to do whatever you want. Once you become a Christian, that's it. You know what? You can just go and do what you like, and as long as you say sorry, everything's okay. And it's easy to see how that accusation can come about against teaching grace and faith over law. But Martin Luther never taught that. And the Bible doesn't teach that. And we don't teach that. And the point is even made in this early part of Galatians chapter 3. Verse 2. Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you heard? Don't just say, were you saved? Did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing? Verse 14. He redeemed us in order that the blessings given to Abraham might come to Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Holy Spirit. Christians don't live by law. No, we don't. We don't live by law. We don't need law. Law condemns us, and we don't need to be condemned. We're forgiven. Law tells us what to do every second of every day. We don't need that. Why? Because we have the Spirit of God living in each and every one of us. We have the Spirit of God to guide our consciences and our thoughts and our minds and our hearts and our whole way of thinking. And we trust that Spirit. We have faith in the Spirit of God to lead us, rather than turning to law to tell us what we ought to do every day. The Spirit is part of God. Here's the great doctrine of the Trinity. It is part of God living in you. God lives in us. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, God lives in you. You don't need law. You've got God living in you. And He will guide you. And He will teach you. And He will help you to go the right way. He won't take over every decision making. We still have decisions. Every Christian, every day, still has decisions to make. Every day we have choice. We can make a choice. Am I going to listen to the Spirit of God that is living in me? showing me what's right and showing me what's wrong? Or am I going to listen to my own selfish self that still wants the easy, comfortable life? Am I going to listen to God speaking to me through His Spirit? Or am I going to listen to the 1,001 other voices of friends and family and television and on all of the personality-driven stuff and everything that's on social media? Am I going to listen to that to tell me what I should do and what I shouldn't? Or am I going to listen to the Spirit of God that is living in me and speaking to me every day? We still have those choices. That's why Christians do still get things wrong. It's why Christians do still make mistakes. Luther made terrible mistakes even after he had left and started the Protestant church. He was responsible for some awful persecution of the Baptists. He wrote some stuff about Jews that is just so horrible and was used by Hitler to justify trying to get rid of the Jews out of Germany. So he still made terrible mistakes. He was not perfect by any means. But he was forgiven. He lived by faith in the grace of Jesus Christ. In those moments when he got it wrong, it was when he started listening to other voices and not the Spirit of God that was living in him. That Spirit of God is there to guide us and to lead us into what is best for us and what is best for everybody around us. As Christians, we have the choice every day. What do we listen to? Do we listen to the Spirit of God or do we listen to the other voices? But even when we get it wrong, our relationship with God, our standing before God, is not changed. Our standing before God is as a righteous person who has been given righteousness by God because of our faith in Jesus Christ. We cannot lose that. We are forgiven those sins. When we get it wrong, I think we need to be bold enough and we need to be honest enough to admit that we've got it wrong. We need to try and make amends if that's at all possible. We need to go and repent before God and admit to Him that we've got it wrong and ask for His help to get it right in future. But as we go to Him and as we repent and as we seek to make amends, we do so with faith. Faith that we know Jesus Christ has died to pay the price of that sin. We are not going to be punished for it. We don't have to do some good deed to make up for it. We are not going to go to purgatory to pay for it. We are forgiven and we have a right standing before God. We will make a mess of things. We will get things wrong. As individuals, as a church leader, I will get things wrong. I will make mistakes. But I am forgiven. We are forgiven because of our faith in Jesus Christ. And this was the great awakening that John Calvin had. That all that striving to be right through following rules was not going to work. It was about his faith, his trust, his knowledge of Jesus Christ. It was about God's grace to him. And his relationship with Christ could never, ever be lost and never taken away from him.